The Connection Gathering, inspiring hope, health, and healing. Connecting the dots of your story to transform your life. Connect with us on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Central Standard Time. The Connection Gathering, inspiring hope, health, and healing. Welcome to the show. My name is Jill Reynolds, and I'm the host of this show. And today we were supposed to have this amazing guest up here, but unfortunately, their little doggie got really sick and they had to cancel. So I decided in the 11th hour to come on and let you know a little bit about me. Since the show just began a few weeks ago, I haven't had the opportunity yet to share my story with you to hopefully inspire hope, health, and healing and transform your lives. So the purpose of the show here was inspired by the Holy Spirit, and he gave me the words that we need to inspire hope in him, health of our body because the Holy Spirit resides in us, and healing of our minds from anxiety, depression, loneliness, feelings of not being good enough, with the hopes that when people share their stories on the Connection Gathering, you will see the similarities in their stories instead of the differences, and hopefully your life will be transformed as well. So sit back and hopefully connect the dots of my story today with yours. And I pray that what will result was that your life will have transformation as well. So I want to begin the journey back with my mom and her family and what it was like for her growing up. So my mother was raised by her father was Greek from Greece, and he married my grandmother, her mother, who was only 15 years old from Louisiana. So he was 30 and she was 15. And he owned a Greek restaurant and he spoke very broken English. And almost immediately after they married, she got pregnant. My grandma got pregnant with my uncle, George. And then 2 years later with my mom. And so my mom was born, let's see, my grandma was 15, so 16, 17. My grandma was about 17 years old when she had my mother. And so being that my grandpa worked at the restaurant 24/7, my grandma was very distraught in the marriage. And when my mom was only about 6 years old, she left the marriage and left the children, my mom and my uncle, with my grandpa. And my grandma lived in one of those old Chicago hotel apartments. And so one Halloween, my mom and her brother really excitedly, dressed in their costumes, went to visit her mother. And they were in the elevator. And as my mom was in the elevator, really excited, she was kicking her feet excitedly towards the elevator door, and the gate caught her toes and chopped off the toes on one of her feet. She had to have major surgery and she was put in a wheelchair during rehabilitation because she couldn't walk on her one foot. About this time in my mom and uncle's life, my grandpa had put them in a boarding home because, again, he worked all the time. So they lived in a boarding home, and my mom was only 7. And at that time in the boarding home, one day, the man that was one of the supervisors picked up my mom out of the wheelchair and he raped her at 7 years old and told her never to tell anyone or else he would kill my mother and her brother. So she went through her entire life, years, never telling a soul, but having that trauma in her life of losing her toes, the surgery, her mother and father separation, and then divorce, and then the sexual abuse. So I really do believe what happened, my mother ended up then developing borderline personality disorder. Fast forward it when my mom was around 17, my grandpa went to Greece on a holiday and and my uncle was now in the service. He had left, he was 19 and he left to join the military, was drafted. And so my mom was left home alone and he was gone for 2 months. While in Greece, he met a Greek woman who was only around 23 years old. My mom was 17. He got her pregnant and he brought her back to the United States and brought home a new stepmom for my mother. So she walked in the door, and my mom, whenever she would clean house, my step grandma would say, "No good, no good, do it again." So my mom felt very hurt and rejected and alone. And so she met my dad around 18, 19 years old, and he was smitten and he immediately fell in love with my mom and they married. Well, shortly after they married, my mom got pregnant with my sister. And about 6 months into my sister being born, or a few months, excuse me, of my sister being born, my father's mother developed cancer. So my dad worked two jobs, and then he had to help care for his mom, so he wasn't around very much. So shortly thereafter, 6 months later, after my sister was born, she got pregnant with me. Well, she was so distraught of having to care for one child that when she found out she was pregnant with me, she immediately felt despair and disdain and really despised having another child. And so in the womb, she really did not want me. So from the moment I was born, she had this she would say these words that there's nothing good about you. I wish you never were born. You're double ugly. No one would ever want you. So this was the wording my mother projected onto me, whereas my sister was, "Oh, Gwenny, you're so wonderful. I love you." And then, "Oh, you, I wish you were never born." And so I have memories, it sounds strange, but I have memories of being left in the crib for hours at a time, never being connected with, never being loved, and even a picture of me laying on a queen size bed in the middle of the bed with my mother holding the bottle out like this, not even holding me in her arms to feed me. So there was a deep wound for me of feeling completely despised by my own mother. Now, when my dad would come home after hours of working, and my grandma did die, she passed away, I think, when my sister was one, and I was only, yeah. So before I was even born, my grandmother died. And my father was my lifeline. He was a strong, born again Catholic, and he took us to Mass every Sunday. And he was the type of dad who would kneel down beside a bed and pray with us every night, every meal, would read us bedtime stories, and would do horseback rides with us. And so my dad was my lifeline. And so fast forward it when I was around 4 years old, 3 or 4 years old, my mother started having affairs. And so she had an affair with, believe it or not, the milkman, and got pregnant. She never knew if my brother was my father's child or the other man's. And so that was her secret for years, until years later it came out and they did a DNA test to find out truly my brother was my father's child. But she lived with that burden for years and years and years, actually, until she was in her 50s. She lived with that burden. And so after my brother was born and the affairs, she kept having more affairs. So one day when my dad was hard at work, my mom hired a moving company, and I was only 5.5 years old. And when my dad was at work, she packed us up and moved us from our home to an apartment right down the street from this married man who she was having an affair with. And when we moved into that apartment, it was right by a metro train station. And every night I would cry myself to sleep because I missed my dad so much. And I would hear the metro train go by, and I would just cry myself to sleep and just wanted so badly to go back home and be by my dad. And so what ended up happening is my dad found out where we had moved to because neighbors had given the name of the moving company. And so they were court ordered to bring us back to our house. And in the interim, the man she was having the affair with died suddenly of a heart attack. So that spiraled my mom into a deep, deep depression because the man she had fallen in love with had just suddenly died. Now her marriage with my dad was ending and they filed for a divorce. So we moved back to our home in the same neighborhood with our friends, and my dad had visitation to see us every Sunday. During this time, like I said, my mom was so abusive to me. She was very nice to my sister and my brother, but really, really mean to me. So as a result of it, I really became a very nonverbal child. I would just sit and play quietly with my toys, barely utter a word 6 days a week. And then on Sundays, when my dad would pick us up to take us to church and have us, I remember sitting right behind him in the back seat, and I would purge words and say, Daddy, Daddy, this is what I did this week. Daddy, Daddy, this is what's going on. What's going on with you? And I would have all my words saved up for just Sunday and was nonverbal. And my mom would literally stand over me and scream at me and say, would you talk? And I'd look up at her in fear. I was so afraid to say any words whatsoever. And so, about this time now, since they divorced, my mom went out and got a job, and she got a job as a cocktail waitress at the local bowling alley. And she'd work until 2 o'clock in the morning. She started at like 2 in the afternoon or 3 in the afternoon. So, we became lock-key children, and we would come home from school every day to an empty house. And my sister, I was 7, my sister was 8.5, and my brother was like 3.5, 4 years old, and we'd come home and take care of ourselves. And I remember calling my grandma, my mother's mother. She was still alive. I called my mother's mother and would say, Grandma, how do I make a pot roast? Grandma, how do I make a meatloaf? And we would try to figure out how to cook for ourselves. And we started then going from eating our meals together as a family to us kids making meals and sitting in front of the TV, which became our babysitter. And so at that early of an age, I learned how to shut off any connection with food. And so I would just eat and not even mindfully know what I ate. I want to go back a step though. Before my mother and father's divorce, at around 5 years old, when we would be around the dinner table as a family, I remember eating my meals and telling my family, my mom and my dad, that I had tummy aches. And my dad would say, clean up your plate, or my mom would say, eat your food, but I'd have tummy aches. So I started to learn at 5 years old how to chew my food and spit it out into a napkin. And so I wasn't thriving. I was so malnourished, and found out years later why I was having tummy aches was that I had genetic celiac disease and could not eat the gluten. And back in those days, that's all we ate. So I wanted to pause and say that so that when I take you forward to eating in front of the TV, you can connect the dots that then when I would eat meals in front of the TV, I would eat with no mindfulness and not even know that I had just eaten. So I'm going to take you on a journey because I am recovered now for 7 years of eating disorders. So you can see the connection of where this all went. So the other memory that I have that I want to take you on is my mother was very promiscuous. And so when she got off of work 2 o'clock in the morning, sometimes she'd stay out late at night. And so in the summer months or when we didn't have school, when my mom would be out late and tired, and we'd wake up at 7, 8 in the morning, she would throw us out of the house at 7 or 8, lock the door so she could go back to sleep. And we would literally be outside all day long playing with no bathroom privileges and no food. So I remember my next door neighbor, Mrs. Detillo, would see us out there and she'd say, hey, if you need to use the toilet, come in. And we'd go in. And then she'd say, would you like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? Well, I started to realize at that time how much shame I had around food and hunger. So when she would ask me that question, many times I'd say, oh, I'm not hungry. And so I learned to turn off my hunger cues. And for those of you listening, we all have a hormone in our brain called leptin. And leptin's purpose is to give you signals when you're hungry or full. So when you restrict meals and you don't eat, the leptin turns off. And so you have no idea when you're hungry or full. So I had gotten to a place of so much restriction of meals that I really truly believe as a child, the leptin was turned off. So when she would ask me if I was hungry, I'd say, oh no. And I was skin and bones. And my grandpa used to say that I was going to blow away in the wind because I was so little and tiny. So that was a memory that I have around food and where it originated, some of my eating disorder behaviors of chewing and spitting, and then self starvation and restricting and avoiding meals. Around the time I was 7, my mom met a man at the shoe store and barely knew him, and he proposed and they got married. And he turned out to be an alcoholic. He was bisexual, and he was a bigamist, married to 2 other women besides my mom, which we didn't know. So the memory that I have of Marty when they got married is he paid a lot of attention to me and my mother didn't. And so it set me up to start to be fondled by him because obviously I was connected more to him than my own mom. But one memory that I have that's really important to share was one night I came downstairs to go to the bathroom. We had a house that only had one bathroom on the first floor, and my bedroom was upstairs. And as I walked around the corner, I saw a shadow of him standing there with a knife in his hand. And after I left to go to the bathroom upstairs, I heard him and my mother outside, my mother screaming. And I looked out the window as I saw him stab my mother. And then she fell to the ground and him running towards the house. I was petrified. And my brother and I shared a bedroom together. And my sister was at my grandma's spending the night. So my brother was 4 years old. I picked him up. He was sound asleep, and I put him underneath the twin bed, all the way in the corner, and he was sleeping the whole time. And I remember I was petrified, so I closed my eyes as tight as I could, and I put my hands over my ears, and I held my breath as long as I could, where I was starting to pass out in unconsciousness because I thought if he heard my breathing, he would come and kill me and my brother. And so I did this for such a long time. Like I said, I was nearly unconscious. And the next memory I had was my father coming and finding us under the bed, pulling us out. And I just came out screaming, Daddy, Daddy, is mommy dead? Is mommy dead? And she had been taken to the hospital and she was fine. She had stabbed her in the leg, and the police arrested him. And yet, when she got out of jail, she went right to the jail and found 2 other wives there that were there as well. And so I remember he came home from the jail when they released him to pack his bags. And I was so disconnected with love that as he left, I was crying, begging him to stay. So I had the beginnings of codependency and trying to rescue when things were even that bad. So that's one memory that I have at 7 years old. And when I did a timeline when I was in treatment for codependency and eating disorder, I put on my timeline at 7 years old is the time of my life that I died because I felt so dead inside and that the breath of life had been taken from me. Um, Fast forward the story, and when I got into junior high, my mom met another man and she married Tom. And Tom was a passive aggressive alcoholic. And when he had sex with my mom, he dressed up in women's clothing and he started to groom me. And so he would go past me and he would fondle me or tell me how beautiful I was. And my mother was so angry and hated me so much that she would rage at me and tell me how much she hated me because Tom loved me more than her. And so it set me up where she started banging my head into the walls and started physically abusing me. And the abuse between my mom and Tom were so bad that there were times he'd come home from work and he would be very passive. And then he'd start pouring his martinis and then become aggressive. And there were times he would take all the dishes out of the cupboard and throw them on the floor and even overturn tables. And so it was a pretty insane place to live. And again, I was very quiet at this time and still just really not very engaged in life. Now, my sister was the social butterfly. She became homecoming queen. She had boyfriends and I wasn't. I was just very, very a quiet little girl when all this was taking place. Now, when they would have fights, my sister and I shared a bedroom together now when I was in junior high and high school. with twin beds. And my twin bed was the closest to the door. So when they would have fights till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and we couldn't sleep, my mother always slept naked and she would get out of bed and she would come into our room and crawl into my twin bed next to me naked. And so not until I went into therapy years later did my therapist let me know that that's considered covert, covered up um, sexual abuse, because it doesn't look like it's sexual abuse, but it is. And there were no boundaries in our house. People walked through the house naked. Doors were kept open when sex was being done. So I grew up with very little boundaries, knowing any idea what boundaries looked like. And I had no idea what connection was. I never felt wanted nor connected. Those were my two biggest burdens. So one day I met a boy at a dance, and he was 17 and I was 14, and he invited me to his house. I was so excited that a boy invited me over. So I went there and walked in the door, sat on this flowered couch underneath a pictured window. And as we talked, he leaned in to kiss me and he pushed me down. And before I knew it, he pulled down my pants and he raped me. And afterwards said, "I've made you a woman. You can now leave." And I remember walking 5 miles home, bleeding and crying. And when I got home, showering and never telling a soul. After that rape happened, and I was so dis, disassociated with my body, I started taking White Cross amphetamines, and I thought if I took them, it would suppress my appetite even more. And so I took handfuls of those and wanted to minimize my body. So I didn't want myself to develop. So boys would look at me. So I started wearing flannel shirts and shit kicker boots and blue jeans. And I tried really desperately to hide my body so no one paid attention to me anymore. And so I went through high school like this, never being asked out on dates, but having friends. And I went from being I started high school then as a greaser, that was the thing, and started smoking cigarettes and doing more and more drugs. I started taking peyote buttons and dropping acid and doing angel dust and all kinds of psychedelics. And so my life just went into a whirlwind. Well, what happened then is through the result of me acting out with drugs, I ended up becoming one of the top 10 worst freshmen. We were cutting classes. I failed freshman year. And our school did a program where they interviewed us and asked us if we wanted to change. They put us in special programs our sophomore year, and we were in special classes. And out of the 10 girls in the classes, 9 of us graduated and only one dropout, which the ratio should have been just the opposite, 9 dropouts. And so I started going to classes, and believe it or not, I finished high school a half a year early after flunking out. And right before I finished high school, I made a film on child abuse, and it won the Illinois Film Festival Award. And I didn't even know it because I had graduated a half a year early and found out from my film festival teacher when I went back to get my diploma that I had won the film festival, because I knew all about child abuse. So I made a phenomenal film. And so my stepdad and my mom got in horrible fights. And one day he walked out on her to meet another woman. On my 18th birthday, in so much despair, my sister had met a guy when she turned 18, and she left home to move in with him. When she left home and I turned 18, the day of my 18th birthday, with $25 in my wallet, I walked away from the insanity of living with my mom and the abuse, and unfortunately left my poor brother at home with it. And I didn't know where to go. I met a girl in downtown Chicago, just on the streets. She had told me that these two guys had a house in Old Town. One was a black male probation officer, one was a gay white cab driver, and Kathy was a Playboy bunny. She got me an interview with the bunny mother, and I interviewed to become a Playboy bunny, and I got hired. But when they told me that I had to wear false eyelashes and stiletto heels, I brought the uniform back and said, "I just can't do this. This is way too feminine for me," because I still had those body image issues after my sexual abuse and date rape. And so I worked as a Holiday Inn Central reservationist. Kathy worked from 3 in the afternoon until 2 in the morning, and I worked 8 to 5. And when I'd come home, I'd shower, go to bed, and then I'd get up at 2 in the morning, and we'd party until 5 or 6 in the morning, and we'd do lots and lots of drugs and act crazy. So one day we went to see Emerson, Lake and Palmer and got in backstage where I met a roadie from ELP, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, who also worked for James Gang in Black Oak, Arkansas. And we started dating, and he wanted to marry me, but I wasn't ready. So we broke up, and I thought, I'm tired of Chicago. So I hitchhiked to Arizona and lived in Arizona for about 8 months, where I met a girl named Michelle, and she wanted to travel. So her and I hitchhiked to Portland, Oregon, where I worked at a concert hall, and met some people from Humble Pie, and a gentleman who worked lighting for Fleetwood Mac. And, God bless Christy McVie, who just passed away from Fleetwood Mac. And so I started hanging out with lots of bands and partying, and then ended up moving to San Diego. When I got to San Diego, Michelle's mother lived there and she wanted to go there. So we ended up in San Diego. And when I got to San Diego, shortly thereafter, at 19 years old, I met this guy named Michael at a bar and started to date him. I had fake ID, so I was in a bar at 19 when I should have been 21. And he was a surfer, but he also was a cocaine dealer. And so within a few months of dating Michael, I started doing cocaine. And it started off just gradually, and then and at that time, I ended up meeting a girl named Bree, who turned out to be, because I had met so many people in the music industry. By this time, I was friends with all the concert promoters in Chicago, and now the concert promoters in California. So I had backstage access to every concert in the 70s, and could go to all of them and party with all the bands and stuff. In fact, I taught Stevie Nicks how to do Tai Chi backstage, and I gave a back massage to Asa from AC/DC when he had laryngitis before he went on stage. So was doing lots of crazy stuff, partying with all different people. And I met this girl named Bree through the program director at KPRI Radio, and she became my roommate. And we moved in together, and she emceed all the concerts, which got us backstage, and I became a promotion assistant at the radio station. And after I became a promotion assistant for a couple of months, I ended up not working anymore at the radio station and started cocktail waitressing and bartending, where I met a man who owned a bar. And the two things I said in life that I would never, ever, ever do was, I said I'd never be a prostitute, and I would never do heroin. Anything else went. And so I ended up meeting this man who told me he owned a bar. And I said, "What's the name of it?" And he said, "Well, the Body Shop." And I said, "Isn't that one of those like strip joints?" And he said, "Yeah, but it's not what you think." So he said, "Come with me and I'll show you." So we went there, and I found out that Miss Nude World worked there. The women who worked there were like tens in beauty. Many of them had college degrees. They worked as a nurse. One was a therapist, and they would dance 2 to 3 nights a week because they'd make more money in 3 days than they would for their whole career. And so I'm at the bar, and I'm doing shots of tequila and lines of Coke in the backstage in the dressing room of the girls that dance. And so one of the girls says, "Well, get up and try it with me." And I'm like, "Oh no, I'll never do this." And she goes, "Just try it." So I was drunk and high. So I got up on stage, and in just doing 3 songs I made, and this was back in the 70s, $100. And I only made like $300 a week working 40 hours. So I thought, wow, I should try this. So before I knew it, I was dancing. And within a year, I could pay cash for a new car. I wasn't sleeping with the guys at all. It wasn't the kind of strip joint where you did lap dancing. It was dancing on stage and having money thrown at you. I came to find out later in my life that one of the reasons that I felt like it was impactful for me to do it is being on stage and the men not being able to touch us. I had power over them. So I've now come to believe, I really do believe, that dancers and prostitutes do that practice because they've been sexually abused, and it gives them power over their abuser. So men could not touch me, but I could entice them, and they would bring me gifts. I mean, I got, you know, beautiful rings and outfits and necklaces, and people would bring me gifts all the time, but they couldn't touch me, and I felt power over that. So during this time, again, I'm dancing, I'm making lots of money, and And then what would happen is I would work Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And I'd get high when we were working. Everybody did. The owner of the place did. But on Saturday night, I'd go to Michael's house after 2 in the morning and with a group of friends. And we literally would get high on Saturday night from 2 a.m., all Saturday night, all Sunday, all Monday. And then on Tuesday in the afternoon, I would then drive back to my apartment and sleep from Tuesday afternoon until Wednesday afternoon to repeat it again and again. And I went from doing lines of cocaine that were normal small lines to lines of cocaine like this. And the more lines I did, the more tequila that I needed or screwdrivers so that I could do more. And then the next thing I knew is we started. Back in those days, we called it burning the coke down to its original form and freebasing it. And so we started freebasing it, and I came to find out years later that freebasing is the same as crack cocaine. And so we were in the midst of doing this. And at that time, with all the drugs, we were doing group sex, and it became very, very insane. Insane. In the midst of this, I ended up one night, we had the last of the cocaine. We had big rocks of coke, and one guy pulled out a gun and said, "Let me have the last hit, or else I'm going to kill everyone." And so I just started realizing our lives had been insane. During this time, um, 2 times I had gone off birth control and got pregnant. The first time on my own, not thinking anything of it, I just went to an abortion clinic and did the abortion. The second, and I ended up then becoming more and more depressed that I did more and more drugs to anesthetize the loss of that first baby. The second time I got pregnant, I was more distraught and almost jumped out of a car at 65 miles an hour on the way to the abortion clinic, hysterically crying and just being totally distraught. And I never asked Michael what he thought. And years later, hearing Dobson talk about men have rights too, I later in life asked Michael, would you have wanted those babies? And he said yes. And I felt so much despair because I really thought that the reason I did the abortions were because Michael didn't want them. And that was not even close to being the truth. So fast forward, I'm high. I'm down to 97 pounds. I'm having blackouts now. And, um, and my girlfriend, now that I was living with Michelle, said, "Hey, I heard about this church down the street, Calvary Chapel, or, in town. And Mike McIntosh is a recovered heroin addict, and he's the pastor of the church." And so she said, "Let's go." So one Wednesday night, we got high, of course, and went to church. And the church in the back row had about 100 people. And Mike McIntosh at the end was saying, um, I'm feeling like the Lord is leading me to say one person in the back row is supposed to come forward and accept the Lord today. And as he said that, my knee twitched and I just pushed it down thinking it was the cocaine. A minute later, Mike said, "The Holy Spirit is telling me that this person in the back row should come forward tonight." And my legs jumped twice. And then I sat there and I went, "Wow, this coke should be wearing off by now." And then he did it a minute later and my legs kept jumping. And so I leaped up, ran forward, and gave my life to Jesus Christ. Now I went home and it freaked me out so much that I laid in bed every single night for about 3 months, just praying to God to help me get clean and sober because I was still getting high. And one night, an incident happened with Michelle and I, where I said, "I'm moving out." I lost my job. I got a tubular infection. And instead of freaking out, I had the most peace come over me. And the Lord said, "Get in your car and move back to Chicago." And I'm like, "Chicago? I'm going to move back." Well, my mother had been involved in a major car accident and had gotten her settlement, had bought 2 condos that hadn't been rented yet. So I moved back to Chicago, rented one of hers. She gave me rent for a month for free. And the Lord brought me a roommate who was a Christian roommate who worked at a Christian broadcasting network. And so I was bartending. And one night, a guy at the bar talked about this church down the street called Willow Creek Community Church. And the Lord told me that night to go back home and sleep after I got off work at 2 o'clock in the morning and to set my alarm. And I started going to church. And I began going to church every week at Willow Creek. And but I still was bartending. And one night I met a guy, went out with him, did a little bit of coke, and had sex with him, and never saw him again. And so I'm going to Willow Creek for about 7 months, and I'm getting cleaner. I'm hardly doing any drugs anymore. I'm getting closer and closer to the Lord. I'm in the singles ministry. And one night, my roommate spent the night at her sister's. And this guy that I had been with at one time called and said, "Hey, Jill, I got some really good Coke. Can I come over?" And I says, "Well, Joey, I don't do Coke anymore, and I'm not sleeping around." And he asked me why. And I said, "Well, because I found the Lord." And he says, "Well, can I come over and you can tell me about God?" So he came over, and within 5 minutes, he poured out a vial of cocaine and said, "It's there in case you wanted it." In a weakened state, I got high. And he wanted to have sex. And I says, "Joey, I can't. I'm not on birth control." And he goes, "Don't worry. I've had a vasectomy." So I slept with him, and 4 weeks later was pregnant. When I got pregnant, I immediately thought, I have to have an abortion. God, I know I'm a Christian, but please just forgive me and let me have one more abortion, because the biggest fear that I had, everyone, is I had grown up with so much shame, humiliation, embarrassment for things that had occurred in my life, that I thought I can't bear the fact that all my Christian friends are going to know that I had sex outside of marriage, because there's only one sin that we can't hide behind, and that's when we have sex outside of marriage and get pregnant. Our pregnancy can be seen through the world. So I thought my only answer was to have another abortion. So I scheduled it, and my roommate and the prayer team at Channel 38 prayed that I would change my mind. Well, 3 days before the abortion, the Holy Spirit had me, convicted me to go take a hot bath. And I sat in the bathroom with candles lit. And as I did, I cried out to the Lord and said, "Jesus, please, please forgive me for what I'm about to do. I'm just so scared what people are going to think." And as I did, with my eyes closed, I literally could see Jesus walking down the path on the way to be crucified, as the crowds were screaming out, you know, "If you're really the Lord, then save yourself." And they were mocking him, and they were ridiculing him, and they were spitting at him, and they were humiliating him. And as Jesus fell to the ground with the cross bleeding, he looked up at me and said, "Jill, why do you care what man thinks of you when I've suffered more embarrassment, humiliation, and shame more than anyone in the world?" And so, with that, I canceled my abortion and had my son. And today, in November, he just turned 40. And I have three amazing grandchildren. And I wrote a chapter in the book called Fiercely Faithful, called The Essence of Humility. Well, in ending, I just want to say two more spiritual awakenings the Lord's brought into my life that hopefully will transform yours. And that was this wound that I had from my mother wound. And so one day I was getting a massage, and I always would pray that the people touching me would be Jesus's hand. So as this person was doing a massage and the lights were turned off and the candles were lit, she was working on my shoulder. And as she did, I turned to the left and I got into a fetal position, which was weird, and started to suck my thumb. As my eyes were closed, I saw the brightest, whitest light you can imagine in my vision, in my eyes. And as I did, I saw the hands of God come down. And as his hands came down, he took the sperm and the egg and he said, "Jill, I am forming you in your mother's womb. I am love. I am the great I am. You are loved and you are created in my image, and you are wanted." And then he went and he said, "I'm breathing life into you." At that moment, I stood up, and the therapist, who is Buddhist, says, "What just happened in this room?" And I told her, and she goes, "I've never seen anything like this when I've worked on someone." And I had radiance and hope and healing. So for those of you who have gone through anything in your life feeling embarrassment, humiliation, or shame, please understand that the essence of your humility is within God, and realize in your life, please, that you are created in the image of God and you were wanted. So if you ever feel like you weren't wanted or you weren't loved, realize the impact of the essence of humility and God. And so, thank you so much for listening to my story and knowing a little bit about who I am today. And thank you so much for joining us today on the Connection Gathering. And Before we end, I'd love to show you my bio so you know how to reach out to me for some support. So we're going to show that now for just a moment. And you can see my website is braveheartworkshops.com, where you can contact me for support. And one of the things we're going to be doing here in January at Acts Media and Ministry is we're going to start a gathering, a connection gathering for women. It's going to be on Sundays twice a month from like 3 in the afternoon till 4:30. So if you're living in the Springfield, Missouri area, Branson, Missouri, and would like to join the connection gathering for women, please email me and contact me through the website so I can get your name and contact to reach out to you when we begin this amazing connection gathering where you two could come together and share your stories in community to inspire hope, health, and healing in the world. Now, before I end, I'd love to just give a few words to some sponsors who sponsor our show. And one of them is the company Redemption Shield. When you go on my website, you'll see a tab that says Affiliate Partners, and you'll be able to see Redemption Shield. The woman, Gina Path, who created this company, this is one of her products here. It's amazing. And what it is all the 5G cells that have come up are bringing in so many radioactive signals into the earth, into the airwaves, that it really can be very harmful. And she's got a meter that she can read how much of this is going into our bodies. So she created this little wallet that you can put your cell phone in, and on one end of it, it's got silver, and it protects so much that you can't even receive a phone call, and it doesn't even track you when it's in here. So when you put that in your body, you won't get a phone call or anything when you put it in here, but you can put it on the other side and it will. But when you put it in your purse or next to you, you want to keep the silver next to your body so the radioactive signals from the cell towers will not go into your body, which could bring about cancer or arthritis or other things. So that's one thing. On the inside part of your cell phone, when you take the cover off, she's got shields. You can put 2 of those on as well to protect yourself when you're on the phone. So these are some of her products. She also sells mats, and I bought the mat, and you put it underneath your fitted sheet. And the mat then has a cord, and you plug that into a power strip in the grounding part of your power strip. And when you sleep on this, it grounds you in bed. And then she has grounding blankets. I have been sleeping on these, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm telling you, I have not slept through the night as long as I can tell you since my car accident. I forgot to tell you I was in a car accident, but that's a whole nother story. And so I've been sleeping with these grounding mats, and oh my gosh, do I feel better when I sleep. So please go on to the website, look for affiliate partners. And I really do believe I bought literally 25 of the round shields, and I put 4 of them on my laptop, on my PCs, on the back of my TVs, and on my microwave to protect my home. She did a test in my home, and my home lit up like a microwave oven. I mean, a microwave, an MRI machine. There were so many cells because my home is 3 miles away from a 5G cell tower. So I put these all over my house to protect myself. So anyway, that's Redemption Shield, and I'm just so grateful you've joined us today for the connection gathering. And we look forward to seeing you next week. We've got an amazing guest. So stay tuned next week for the connection gathering. Thanks so much. Have a wonderful day. The Connection Gathering. Thanks for joining us, connecting unity in Christ through the Holy Spirit. AMG Broadcasting thanks you for being a faithful listener, supporter, and sponsor. Help to keep our programs on the air. Support us and donate today. To donate, please go to axmediagroup.com. Subscribe to our channels now and don't miss any episodes. The Axe Media AMG Broadcasting YouTube and Rumble channels are below. Please like our social media sites also.